He made Jaws when he was 27 years old, and he invented the summer blockbuster before most of the world knew what a blockbuster was. He made Schindler's List when he was 46, and he convinced an entire generation that cinema could carry the weight of the worst chapter in human history. He made E.T. the Extraterrestrial when he was 35, and he created the most successful film of his era, not with explosions or spectacle, but with a boy, a bicycle, and a feeling. 79 years old, 2 Academy Awards, 62 directorial credits, a net worth of $9.1 billion. And on June 12th of 2026, he walked out of the premiere of Disclosure Day with the same look on his face he had walking out of a Super 8 screening in his parents' living room when he was 13 years old. That is the paradox of Steven Spielberg. That is the contradiction no biographer has ever fully explained. But behind that legend lies a story not glamorous, but deeply, achingly human. A boy rejected by every film school he applied to. A son who watched his family fracture before he was old enough to understand why. A filmmaker who spent 50 years chasing wonder, and found, at the end of that chase, that the most important story he ever needed to tell was the one he had been running from his entire life. What does it cost a man to give the world its dreams while still searching, quietly and urgently, for his own? If Steven Spielberg has ever made you feel something you did not expect to feel in a dark room surrounded by strangers, hit like as a tribute to the man who made the impossible feel personal. It is remarkable when a life as extraordinary as Spielberg's is marked not by arrival, but by constant seeking. Because even now, at 79, he has not stopped looking. Steven Allen Spielberg was born on December 18th of 1946 in Cincinnati, Ohio. The first child of Arnold Spielberg, a computer engineer whose work kept the family in a state of permanent motion, and Leah Adler, a concert pianist whose emotional warmth was the one constant in a childhood defined by change. By the time Steven was a teenager, the family had lived in New Jersey, in Arizona, and in California. New schools, new neighborhoods, new attempts at belonging. The boy, who would one day make the world feel at home in the darkness of a movie theater, spent his early years never quite feeling at home anywhere at all. Arnold Spielberg was a brilliant and exacting man, a visionary in the early days of electronic computing, a figure of genuine historical importance in a field that was just beginning to understand what it was. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew the family, a man of science in a household that ran on feeling. Leah was the opposite, chaotic and creative and luminous, a woman whose love for her son was as enormous as her discomfort with the ordinary. The marriage between them was not unhappy so much as it was misaligned, two people who admired each other across a distance they could never quite close. Steven felt that distance the way children always do, not as an abstraction, but as the specific weight of a room where two people are not quite speaking to each other. He was 12 years old when he picked up a Super 8 camera for the first time. The world did not stop. Nobody handed him a prize, but something in the boy clicked into place with the weight of that small machine in his hands. A recognition, instant and permanent, that this was the language he had been waiting to find. At 13, he made a 40-minute war film called Escape to Nowhere and entered it in a local competition. It won. He was not the kind of boy who won things. He was the kind of boy who moved too often and laughed too loudly and did not fit neatly into any of the categories that school required of him. But with a camera in his hands, none of that mattered. His academic record reflected a mind that was interested in everything except what was being taught. When the time came to apply to the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts and to the film school at the University of California, Los Angeles, the two most prestigious film programs in the country, Both rejected him. His grades were too low. He was not, on paper, the kind of student those institutions were looking for. He was, as it turned out, the kind of student they would spend the next 50 years wishing they had let in. There is a version of Steven Spielberg's story that begins with rejection and ends with resignation. A young man told twice by the institutions that guard the gates of his chosen profession that he does not qualify, that his grades are too low, his credentials too thin, his application too ordinary to merit entry. That version of the story ends in a different life, a quieter life, perhaps a respectable one. That is not the version that happened. What happened instead was this. Steven Spielberg, at the age of 17, visited Universal Studios as a tourist and did not leave. Not in the way visitors leave. He walked the lot, watched the machinery of professional filmmaking in motion, and understood with the clarity that only the very young and the very certain ever possess, that this was where he needed to be. He began arriving at the studio without credentials, dressed in a suit borrowed from his father, carrying a briefcase that contained nothing of professional consequence, but projected the unmistakable silhouette of someone who belonged. Security guards nodded him through. Executives passed him in hallways and assumed someone else had hired him. He found an empty office and began using it. He met editors. He met directors. He watched everything. He was not stealing. He was studying. And the distinction mattered enormously to the man he was becoming. His first genuine professional break came in 1971, when Universal gave him the chance to direct a television film called Duel, a stripped-down psychological thriller about a traveling salesman pursued across the California desert by a massive, faceless truck driver whose motivations are never explained and whose face is never shown. The film had a budget of modest television proportions. It had a shooting schedule of 13 days. What it had in abundance was tension, a specific, mounting, relentless dread that Spielberg constructed not with elaborate set pieces, but with camera placement, with sound, with the terrible intimacy of a man who cannot understand why something enormous wants to destroy him. Duel aired on ABC on November 13th of 1971. It was not supposed to be a cultural event. It became one anyway. Critics who expected a television movie found instead a masterclass in suspense from a 24-year-old director who had not attended a single day of film school. The film was later expanded and released theatrically in Europe, where it was received as the work of a significant new talent. Universal took notice. The industry took notice. And Spielberg, who had spent years arriving at a place where no one had formally invited him, was now exactly where he had always intended to be. The films that followed in those early years announced a filmmaker of unusual instincts, someone who understood not just how to create fear or wonder or sentiment, but how to make an audience feel that those emotions were their own. The Sugarland Express in 1974 was a road movie of genuine emotional complexity, based on a true story, anchored by a performance from Goldie Hawn that Spielberg coaxed into something raw and irreducible. It was not a blockbuster, it was something more interesting. Proof that the young director could handle register as well as spectacle. And then came the summer of 1975, and the ocean, and the shark, and the moment that changed everything, not just for Steven Spielberg, but for the entire architecture of American popular cinema. What happens when a 27-year-old director, working on a film that is already over budget and weeks behind schedule, with a mechanical shark that refuses to function, decides to hide the monster entirely, and discovers that what the audience cannot see is infinitely more terrifying than what it can? Jaws opened on June 20th of 1975 in 464 theaters across the United States. It had cost $8 million to make, more than double its original budget, a consequence of a production so troubled that the crew nicknamed the malfunctioning mechanical shark Bruce and spent entire shooting days watching it sink into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. The studio was nervous. Spielberg was exhausted. And then the numbers came in. Jaws earned $7 million on its opening weekend alone. By the end of its theatrical run, it had earned $470 million worldwide, making it, at that moment, the highest-grossing film in the history of cinema. It invented the concept of the wide summer release. It invented the modern blockbuster. It established the template that Hollywood would follow imperfectly and hungrily for the next 5 decades. And it was directed by a 27-year-old who had solved his central production problem not with technology or money, but with restraint, by deciding that what he could not show, he would make the audience imagine instead. The lesson of Jaws was not about sharks. It was about trust. Specifically, the filmmaker's trust that an audience's imagination, properly guided, will always conjure something more frightening than anything a camera can photograph. Spielberg carried that lesson forward. 2 years later, in 1977, he released Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a film about ordinary people drawn, against all reason and social consequence, toward an experience of contact with something beyond their understanding. Where Jaws had weaponized the ocean, Close Encounters weaponized the sky. Where Jaws had hidden its monster, Close Encounters made its revelation the emotional climax of the entire film. A sequence of light and music and convergence that remains, nearly 50 years later, one of the most purely cinematic moments ever committed to film. Then came Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981, a collaboration with George Lucas that produced the most purely entertaining adventure film of its generation and introduced Indiana Jones to a world that would spend the next 4 decades refusing to say goodbye to him. And then E.E.T., the extraterrestrial, in 1982. The film that surpassed Jaws as the highest-grossing film in history and held that title for 11 years. A story so simple and so devastating in its emotional honesty that it required nothing from its audience except the willingness to feel. These were not merely successful films. They were cultural events that restructured the emotional vocabulary of an entire generation. Children who saw E.T. in the summer of 1982 are now adults in their 40s and 50s, who can still describe, frame by frame, the sequence in which a boy on a bicycle rises against a full moon. That image does not live in the memory because it was technically impressive. It lives there because Spielberg understood something about longing and friendship, and the terror of loss that resonated at a frequency children recognized instinctively, and adults had forgotten they knew. Through the mid-'80s and into the '90s, the pace did not slow. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom in 1984. The Color Purple in 1985. His first serious engagement with literary drama, adapted from Alice Walker's novel, marking the first signal that the director of Jaws was interested in more than spectacle. Empire of the Sun in 1987, starring a 12-year-old Christian Bale in a performance of astonishing gravity. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade in 1989. Hook in 1991. And then, in 1993, 2 films released in the same calendar year that together demonstrated a range no other director of his generation could plausibly claim. Jurassic Park in the summer of 1993 earned $914 million worldwide and introduced digital visual effects at a scale and quality that permanently altered what cinema could show. And then, 6 months later, Spielberg released Schindler's List, a black-and-white film about the Holocaust, about a German industrialist who saved the lives of over 1,000 Jewish workers during the Second World War, about the specific texture of moral courage and moral failure in the most extreme circumstances human beings have ever been required to navigate. Schindler's List won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director, Spielberg's first. It was not the film of a man who had set out to make an important film. It was the film of a man who had been carrying a story for years and finally understood that he was ready to tell it. He donated his entire director's fee to the USC Shoah Foundation, an organization he founded to record the testimonies of Holocaust survivors, a project that has since collected over 55,000 testimonies in 65 countries. 5 years later, in 1998, Saving Private Ryan opened with a 27-minute recreation of the D-Day landings at Omaha Beach that changed permanently and irreversibly the way cinema depicts armed conflict. Veterans who had survived that day in 1944 left theaters unable to speak. The film earned Spielberg his second Academy Award for Best Director, making him only the third director in history to win the award twice. The man who had been rejected by film school twice was now, inarguably, the most commercially successful and one of the most critically respected directors in the history of the medium. But success, as Spielberg was about to discover, does not immunize a man against the ordinary devastations of a human life. There is a version of Steven Spielberg that the public knows with complete confidence. The man behind the camera, the architect of wonder, the director whose name on a poster has functioned for 50 years as a guarantee of a certain quality of feeling. That version is real. It is documented in box office records and Academy Award citations and the cultural memory of several generations of moviegoers who grew up inside his films. The version that is less well documented is the one that lived between the films, the one that came home. Spielberg's first marriage, to actress Amy Irving, lasted from 1985 to 1989. They had one son together, Max Samuel Spielberg, born in 1985. The marriage ended, by most accounts, under the familiar pressure of 2 careers of significant ambition operating in close proximity. The specific friction of 2 people who are each, in their own right, the most important person in any room they enter. The divorce was costly in every sense of the word. Irving received a settlement reported at $100 million. At the time, one of the largest divorce settlements in Hollywood history. Spielberg later reflected on that period with the unsparing honesty of a man who has had decades to sit with his own accounting. He admitted, in terms that were careful but not evasive, that the demands of his career had not always left room for the demands of a marriage. He had already met Kate Capshaw. He met her on the set of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom in 1984. She was playing Willie Scott, the film's female lead, a role that required her to spend a significant portion of the production screaming in various states of peril. What Spielberg encountered on that set was not merely an actress of considerable skill, but a woman of such specific and grounded personal force that he found himself, for the first time in a long time, paying attention to something other than the next shot. The relationship that developed between them was not simple and was not immediate. Spielberg was still married to Amy Irving when he met Kate. The years that followed were complicated in the way that the intersection of genuine feeling and prior commitment always produces complication. But by 1988, Kate Capshaw had converted to Judaism, a decision she described as entirely her own, arrived at independently of any external pressure, a genuine spiritual reckoning rather than a concession to circumstance. And on October 12th of 1991, she and Spielberg were married. They have been married for 35 years. Together, they have built a family of 7 children across biological and adoptive lines. a construction that Spielberg has described not as complicated, but as complete. His son Max from his marriage to Amy Irving, his daughter Jessica, whom he adopted when he married Kate and who had been born from Kate's previous relationship. Their biological son Theo, adopted as an infant in 1988 before Spielberg and Kate were married. Their daughter Sasha, born in 1990. Their son Sawyer, born in 1992. Their daughter Destry, born in 1996. And Michaela, adopted in 1996. 7 children. 1 household. One man who had spent his entire career making films about belonging and had, in the construction of this family, finally built the place where he belonged. Spielberg has spoken about Kate with a consistency and a specificity that is not the language of performance. He has called her the most important decision of his life. Not the films, not the awards, not the studio he founded. The decision to build a life with a woman who was strong enough not to disappear inside his orbit. He once reflected, with the plainness of a man who has stopped needing to impress anyone, that the most powerful force in the world is love, and that it surpasses even cinema. His mother, Leah, whose chaotic warmth had been the emotional center of his childhood, died in 2017 at the age of 97. His father, Arnold, the exacting engineer who had given his son the precision that underlies all that apparent magic, died in 2020 at the age of 103. Both of them lived long enough to watch their son become, without question, the most influential filmmaker the American cinema has ever produced. Spielberg has said that he thinks about both of them every time he sits in a director's chair. The man who spent his childhood moving from state to state, never quite belonging, never quite staying, had found, in his 50s and 60s, something that the films had always been reaching toward but could never fully contain. Stillness, continuity, home. But even a man who has found his home must eventually reckon with the question of what comes next, especially when the next film arrives not as a triumph but as a mirror. There is a particular kind of artistic courage that has nothing to do with ambition. Ambition is easy to understand. It moves forward. It accumulates. It measures itself in the distance between where a person started and where they have arrived. The courage that is harder to name is the kind that moves inward, the kind that turns the camera around, the kind that says, I have spent 50 years telling other people's stories, and now I am going to tell mine, and I am going to tell it honestly, even the parts that do not reflect well on anyone, including myself. Steven Spielberg arrived at that courage in 2022, but the road that led him there passed first through a Broadway stage on the west side of Manhattan, and through a box office result that surprised even the people who had predicted it would disappoint. West Side Story had been a personal project for years. Spielberg's love for the original 1957 Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim musical was genuine and long-standing, and his desire to bring it back to cinema with the full weight of his craft was not a commercial calculation, but an artistic declaration. He cast it with extraordinary care, hiring Rachel Zegler, a complete unknown, discovered through an open casting call, as Maria, and surrounding her with a company of performers whose training and precision honored the material at every level. He hired Tony Kushner, who had written the screenplays for Munich and Lincoln, to adapt the book. He shot it with the visual grandeur that the subject demanded. West Side Story opened in December of 2021. It earned $76 million worldwide against a production budget of $100 million. It was, by any commercial measure, a significant underperformance. Not a catastrophe, but not the triumph that Spielberg's name had historically guaranteed. The film received 7 Academy Award nominations and won 1. Ariana DeBose's extraordinary Best Supporting Actress for her performance as Anita. But the box office result was the number that the industry remembered and repeated. Spielberg absorbed it. He did not dispute it or minimize it. He had made the film he intended to make, and the audience had responded as it had responded. And the arithmetic was what it was. That equanimity, the refusal to perform either devastation or indifference, was itself a kind of statement about the man he had become at 74. And then, 1 year later, he did the hardest thing he had ever done behind a camera. The Fabelmans opened in November of 2022. It is, in the most direct and unambiguous sense, the story of Steven Spielberg's childhood. The parents whose marriage fractured slowly and then suddenly. The mother whose vitality was too large for the life she had chosen. The father whose love was real, but whose emotional language was the language of logic and engineering rather than feeling. The boy who discovered in a camera not an escape from his life, but a way of looking at it clearly enough to survive it. Spielberg changed the names. The family is called Fabelman, not Spielberg, but changed nothing essential. The film is an act of public accounting, delivered with the precision and the tenderness of a man who has had decades to understand what he is accounting for. Michelle Williams plays the mother. Paul Dano plays the father. Gabriel Labelle plays the boy who will become the director. The performances are of the kind that exist only when a filmmaker has given his actors the full truth of the material and trusted them to carry it. Williams received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. The film received 7 nominations in total, including Best Picture and Best Director. Spielberg's 7th nomination in that category, making him the most nominated director in the history of that award. It earned $45 million worldwide. 2 consecutive films, West Side Story and The Fabelmans, had arrived with the full force of Spielberg's craft and his reputation and his genuine artistic investment, and both had fallen substantially short of the commercial expectations that his name historically generated. The industry, which has always confused box office with verdict, began to construct a narrative. The narrative said that perhaps Spielberg's cultural moment had passed, that the audiences who had grown up on his films had grown past them, that the wonder he had spent 50 years manufacturing was a commodity whose market had shifted. Spielberg, characteristically, did not engage with the narrative. He said about The Fabelmans, something that functioned less as a defense and more as a clarification. This was the most personal film he had ever made, and the box office did not measure whether the story needed to be told. The story had needed to be told. He had told it. That was the complete transaction. What the narrative missed, what it always misses when it reduces an artist to his most recent numbers, was the specific quality of mind that had produced 62 films across 50 years and shown no signs, none whatsoever, of contraction or exhaustion. The wonder was not a commodity. It was a constitutional trait. And constitutional traits do not respond to box office results. What does it look like when a 78-year-old director, twice commercially disappointed in succession, walks back onto a set and reminds the world exactly who he is? The production of Disclosure Day began in a climate that was, by any reasonable measure, not obviously favorable to the kind of film Steven Spielberg wanted to make. The box office landscape of 2025 and 2026 had been reshaped by streaming, by franchise fatigue, by an audience whose attention had been subdivided into smaller and smaller units, by platforms competing for the same finite hours in a human day. Original films, films that were not sequels, not reboots, not extensions of pre-existing intellectual property, had become increasingly difficult to finance at significant budgets, increasingly difficult to market, and increasingly difficult to open in the wide theatrical release that had defined Spielberg's entire professional relationship with his audience. None of that stopped him. Disclosure Day is, at its structural core, a film about two people who come into possession of information so significant that the world is not prepared to receive it, and who decide, against all rational self-interest and at considerable personal cost, to give it to the world anyway. A cybersecurity specialist, played by Josh O'Connor, steals classified files containing documented evidence of extraterrestrial life. A television meteorologist, played by Emily Blunt, becomes his unlikely partner in the project of making that evidence public. Colin Firth plays the government official whose institutional mandate is to prevent exactly what these two people are attempting. Coleman Domingo and Eve Hewson complete a cast of 5 principal performers who each, in their own register, carry the weight of a story that is simultaneously a thriller, a romance, and a meditation on the nature of truth and the cost of telling it. The music is by John Williams. It is, by the count, that both men have confirmed publicly their 30th collaboration, a number that sits at the outer edge of what the word collaboration can reasonably contain, because what Spielberg and Williams have built across 53 years is not a professional relationship, but a shared artistic language, a grammar of emotional orchestration that each understands in the other without the need for extended explanation. Williams was 93 years old during the recording sessions for Disclosure Day. The score he delivered was described by critics as among the most optimistic work of his career, full of the ascending motifs and the sense of vast, benevolent space that had characterized his earliest collaborations with Spielberg in the 1970s. That word, optimistic, appeared in review after review when Disclosure Day opened on June 12th of 2026. Spielberg's 79th birthday falls in December, but the film arrived in the summer, and the summer framing was deliberate. A conscious decision to release a film about wonder and revelation in the season that Spielberg himself had, 51 years earlier, defined as the season of wonder and revelation. The release was a statement. The timing was a thesis. Rotten Tomatoes certified the film at 80%. A score that represented not universal acclaim, but something more durable. Genuine critical consensus that Disclosure Day was the work of a filmmaker operating with full command of his craft and full clarity of his intentions. Reviewers who had spent 2 years constructing the narrative of Spielberg's commercial and cultural decline found themselves writing, with varying degrees of acknowledged surprise, that the film felt like a return. Not to a younger version of Spielberg, but to the essential version, the one that had always believed, with a sincerity that was never naive because it was always earned, that the universe was larger and stranger and more generous than the evidence of daily life suggested. Emily Blunt's performance was singled out across the critical consensus as the engine of the film's emotional credibility. A woman who begins the story as a skeptic and ends it as a witness, whose transformation the audience experiences not as a plot mechanism, but as a genuine reckoning. Josh O'Connor brought to his role the specific quality of moral urgency that the character required. A man who knows what he knows and cannot unknow it and must decide at every moment whether knowing is enough reason to act. The film earned $232.9 million worldwide against a total cost of $195 million. The domestic performance fell below the expectations that Spielberg's name generated in the American market, a pattern that had now extended across 3 consecutive films. But the international numbers told a different story, and the critical reception told yet another, and Spielberg himself, interviewed in the weeks following the premiere, demonstrated the equanimity of a man who has long since stopped measuring his work in the currency that the industry prefers. He spoke, in those interviews, about the specific pleasure of returning to the material that had animated his earliest films, the science fiction of Close Encounters, the optimism of E.T., the conviction that contact with something beyond our ordinary experience is not a threat to be contained but a wonder to be received. He spoke about the cast with the warmth of a director who has learned, across 50 years of working with actors, that the best performances are not extracted, but invited. He spoke about John Williams with the reverence of a man describing someone who has been, across half a century, as close to a creative twin as the language of professional collaboration permits. And then, in one interview, he was asked whether he thought about slowing down. He paused. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, rather than deflecting it with the practiced graciousness of a man accustomed to deflecting questions he does not wish to answer. And then he said, with a quietness that was not humility but precision, that slowing down would require him to stop being curious, and that he had not, in 78 years of living, found a reliable method for doing that. The man who had been rejected by film school twice, who had invented the blockbuster at 27, who had documented the Holocaust at 46, who had told the story of his own childhood at 75, who had returned at 78 to the optimism that had been his original artistic signature, was still, by every available measure, incapable of looking at the world without wanting to show it to someone. That is not a career. That is a constitution. There is a question that the history of Steven Spielberg's career keeps returning to, not because it lacks an answer, but because the answer keeps refusing to stay answered. The question is this: what is the source of it? What is the origin of the specific quality of feeling that his films produce? That sensation, familiar to several generations of moviegoers across every continent on Earth, of being simultaneously very small and very safe, of being in the presence of something enormous that means you know well? The biographical record suggests several candidates: the childhood defined by motion and displacement, the boy who never belonged to any single place and therefore learned to create belonging on a screen, the parents whose emotional opposition produced, in the space between them, a child of unusual sensitivity to the frequencies of human feeling, the camera that arrived at 12 years old and provided, for the first time, a language adequate to what the boy was already experiencing, the film schools that said no and produced, in their refusal, a filmmaker who learned his craft not from institutions, but from the irreplaceable education of watching and doing and failing and watching again. All of those things are true. All of them contributed. But none of them, individually or in combination, fully accounts for the specific phenomenon of Steven Spielberg. For the fact that a man who turned 79 in December of 2025 walked onto the set of Disclosure Day, at an age when most of his contemporaries had long since settled into legacy and retrospective, and made a film that critics described as a return to wonder. Wonder, it turns out, is not a phase. It is not a function of youth or of circumstance or of the particular cultural moment that happened to be receptive to a certain kind of story. Wonder, in the case of Steven Spielberg, is constitutional. It is the operating system, not the application. It does not require favorable conditions. It does not respond to box office results or critical consensus or the industry's quarterly assessment of what audiences want. It simply persists, the way a current persists beneath the surface of water that appears, from above, to be entirely still. He will turn 80 years old on December 18th of 2026. He will have been directing films professionally for more than 55 years. He will have accumulated a filmography of 62 directorial credits, 2 Academy Awards for Best Director, a net worth of $9.1 billion, and a cultural footprint so large and so deep that the history of American cinema cannot be written, cannot even be described in outline, without his name appearing in virtually every chapter. And somewhere, on some project that has not yet been announced, in some early conversation about a story that has not yet been fully shaped, he is already thinking about the next one. Not because he needs to prove something, not because the industry requires it of him, but because the curiosity that picked up a Super 8 camera in 1958 has never, in all the decades since, found a reason to put one down. He made Jaws at 27, and he gave the world its fear of the ocean. He made Schindler's List at 46, and he gave the world a record of its own capacity for both evil and grace. He made The Fabelmans at 75, and he gave the world the story he had been carrying longest, the one that began not on a movie set, but in a living room in New Jersey, with a boy and a camera, and two parents who loved each other in ways they could not always make visible. He made Disclosure Day at 78, and he gave the world, one more time, the thing he has always given it best. The feeling that the universe is stranger and larger and more willing to astonish us than we had, in our more cautious moments, allowed ourselves to believe. The subject changed. The wonder never did. If you have ever sat in a dark room and felt something you did not expect to feel, something that arrived without warning and stayed longer than the credits, then you already know what Steven Spielberg gave you. Leave a tribute in the comments for the man who made the impossible feel personal, who made the extraordinary feel like something that could happen to you, in your town, on your street, on an ordinary evening when the sky was doing something unusual. What do you carry with you from his films? What did he show you that you had not known you needed to see? Subscribe to Golden Fame News, because the stories worth telling are never the ones the headlines give you first.